Hi again. So here we are with part five of our week 10 discussion of religion and empire in modern East Asia. This segment looks at an article that was actually on the week 9 readings, but we didn't get a chance to finish talking about it last week. And I said we would talk about it this week as it also has to do with empire as well as nationalism, our topic last week. So uh, it starts off this article by P. von Nguyen, uh, looking at the end of its time scope and asking kind of how did we get there? So in 1963, there was what was called the Buddhist crisis in the Republic of Vietnam or South Vietnam, where the president was accused by Buddhists of supporting Catholicism over Buddhism, of not recognizing Buddhism as a religion officially, and prohibiting the Buddhist flag, and violently putting down anti government demonstrations by Buddhists. And the thick of all of this, a famous older Buddhist monk burned himself alive in a public square protesting the government's treatment of Buddhism. This very famous incident was in global news and sparked similar protests by other Vietnamese monks and many years later by Tibetan monks protesting the PRC state. Nguyen wants to argue, though, that despite the president's Catholicism and his being related to one of the bishops in Vietnam, President Ngo never declared that Catholicism was the official religion of uh, Vietnam, although Buddhists were afraid that the government would make such a declaration. And there was no systemic suppression of Buddhism on religious grounds. So, what happened? Nguyen argues that the Republic wanted to use the political mobilization of religious groups, including Buddhism, that emerged during the war against the French, sometimes called the First Indochina War, um, and that it used spirituality as a way of trying to define the national character in opposition to communism. Uh, and this freedom of religion, it said, must make religion a private affair and not something that the government officially sponsors or promotes. Um, and so, yeah, it has to be something that's freely chosen. So, this is what we talked about secularism last week. And while there were persecutions against two new religious movements that had been encouraged by the Japanese during their occupation, these were more political or military in nature rather than religious persecutions, Wynne wants to say. Okay, let's look at some more of this and see if we can understand this a little bit better. So, after the French War, which ended in 1954, the prime minister, who later became president, uh, tried to create what he called a third way against both imperialism and communism, called the Personalist Revolution, which he saw based as spirituality. So, if you remember, the French had colonized Vietnam, they brought Catholicism, and in the fighting off the French, right, one of the possibilities was to become communist, like China to the north, and Nguyen wanted neither to be a colony of a Western power nor a communist country. He wanted this third way, and he saw spirituality as very important to that. The Catholics were very anti communist, but the church could not officially engage in politics or independence movements. But at the same time, many Catholics got involved with the nationalist party Dai Viet, which was anti communist. The Buddhists were also anti imperialist nationalists, but they did not take such a clear anti communist stand. And over the course of the 1950s, Buddhists and another religious group called the Baha'i were upset that they were not recognized as religions by the state, but just as organizations. And this was part of the state's promotion of spiritual nationalism, which it did not want to promote individual religions, but rather cultivate a spiritual identity of all South Vietnamese as a way of opposing both imperialism and communism. As the state grew less popular and the Buddhists announced that they would not oppose communism, the government began interfering with Buddhist meetings, including a celebration of Buddha's birthday, Vesak, and it eventually banned any flag except for the national flag. So that included the Buddhist flag, which it had taken away at a particular gathering in 1963. At the same time, Buddhists criticized the state for not imposing these same restrictions on Catholics, and they saw this as a kind of a double standard. And this grew to growing conflicts between the state and Buddhist institutions, as well as conflicts between Buddhists and Catholics. And Nguyen points out here that religion and politics are very much entangled with each other, and you can't necessarily see them as separate. Okay, so for the think about it question for your class participation, I'm going to ask kind of a tough question, but see if you have some kind of response. Um, so the question is, how was imperialism related to the Buddhist crisis in Vietnam in 1963? So you could think about the French who had colonized Vietnam. Vietnam was fighting against the French and then was left in what we call a post-colonial setting where it was trying to determine its national character. So if you could just say a sentence or two, what you think about the relationship between imperialism and the Buddhist crisis in 1963, that'd be great. Thanks so much, and I'll put up a couple more videos soon.